The restaurant was alive with the low hum of conversations, the occasional clinking of cutlery, and the comforting smell of freshly baked bread drifting through the air. It wasn't a fancy place, not the kind where you'd expect to see men in tailored suits or women in diamond earrings. It was an ordinary little diner, tucked into a busy street corner, its booths patched and its tables worn down by years of regulars who found solace in its simplicity. And yet, on this particular evening, that modest diner was about to witness a story that would change two lives forever. In the far corner, sitting by the window where the last streaks of sunset painted the glass gold, was a man who didn't quite fit in. His presence was commanding, though he carried himself with quiet restraint. His black suit was custom-made, the kind you could only get in the hands of the finest tailors, and the wristwatch glinting under the dim diner lights could have paid for the entire block. This was Richard Callahan, one of the wealthiest men in the city, though no one here recognized him. His empire stretched across continents, his name whispered in corporate boardrooms like a legend. But in that small diner, none of it mattered. To him, tonight wasn't about power or status. Tonight, his eyes were fixed on the boy sitting across from him. The boy, no older than 10, had eyes as blue as a summer sky and a smile that was both innocent and weary. His small hands struggled to grip the fork, the tremor in his fingers betraying the challenges of his condition. Ethan had been born with cerebral palsy. Though sharp as a whip in mind and spirit, his body often refused to cooperate. To Richard, watching his son struggle was like a knife twisting deeper into his chest each day. He could buy the world, but he could not buy away his child's pain. And so he sat there, helplessly watching as Ethan's frustration grew, the boy's fork slipping once, twice, until finally clattering against the plate with a sound that turned a few heads nearby. "Dad." "I can't," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking with both shame and anger. His cheeks flushed red as he looked down, embarrassed by the curious eyes that briefly fell upon him. Richard leaned forward, his voice low and steady, trying to mask the ache in his heart. "It's okay, son. Take your time. We'll figure it out together." But before Richard could reach for the fork himself, another hand appeared, delicate, graceful, yet firm with purpose. The waitress, who had been quietly observing from across the room, stepped in, crouching beside Ethan with a warm, genuine smile. Her name tag read Lily. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, her hair tied back in a messy bun, strands falling loose as if she'd been rushing all day. But there was a softness in her eyes, a kindness that wasn't rehearsed like the polite charm of most servers. It was real. "Hey, champ," she said gently, her tone carrying not a trace of pity. "How about we do this together? You hold the fork and I'll help guide your hand. Deal?" Ethan blinked at her, surprised that she spoke to him not as if he was fragile, but as if he was capable. Slowly he nodded. Richard's breath caught in his chest as he watched her. With patience and care, Lily steadied Ethan's trembling hand, guiding the fork toward the slice of pancake on his plate. His grip tightened, and though the fork wobbled, it found its way to the bite-sized piece. Together they lifted it up, and Ethan beamed with pride as he took the bite himself. For a moment the boy's laughter filled the air, light and unburdened, and Richard felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. But beneath his relief was confusion. He wasn't used to strangers stepping into his world, let alone ones who could touch his son's life in ways his billions never could. Who was this young woman? Why did she care enough to notice his son's struggle, let alone help without hesitation? As Richard's sharp eyes studied her, something stirred inside him, an unfamiliar mix of gratitude and curiosity, tinged with a hint of unease. And then, just as Richard opened his mouth to speak, the diner's door swung open with a loud bang, and in walked someone whose presence promised trouble. The door creaked open, and for a fleeting second the cheerful chatter in the diner faltered. A man in a leather jacket strode in, his boots heavy against the tiled floor. He wasn't connected to Richard's life, not directly, but his rough entrance created a tension that hung in the air. Richard's protective instinct flared instantly, his hand subtly shifting closer to Ethan's side, his gaze sharp and unyielding. But the moment passed as the stranger walked toward the counter, demanding coffee, in a voice that carried more bitterness than caffeine. Still, Richard remained alert, his jaw set, his heart reminding him that the world was rarely kind to those who couldn't defend themselves. He looked back at Ethan and Lily, who were laughing softly as they continued their teamwork with the pancakes. The sound was like a balm on an old wound. Richard found himself studying Lily in a way he hadn't studied anyone in years, not as a potential employee, not as a business asset, but as a person who radiated something rare in his world. She wasn't calculating, she wasn't performing. She was simply present, offering patience where most would only give pity. But as he watched her, another memory surfaced, shadows of hospital corridors, sleepless nights, and the woman who had once stood where Lily now knelt, Ethan's mother. Claire had been radiant, compassionate, and brave. Richard had loved her with a depth he hadn't known himself capable of. But tragedy has a way of rewriting lives. She'd been gone nearly 5 years now, taken by a sudden illness that neither wealth nor doctors could outwit. Richard had thrown himself into work, building empires of glass and steel, trying to bury his grief under towers of success. But no amount of money could soothe Ethan's tears at night, nor fill the hollow space left behind, and so Richard had become two men, the untouchable billionaire the world admired, or envied, and the broken father who quietly mourned behind closed doors. To the public he was power incarnate. To Ethan he was dad. But inside he was haunted by one unshakable truth. He could buy almost anything, except happiness for his son. Now in this diner, a young waitress was doing what he could not, giving Ethan a moment of normalcy, of dignity, of joy. The realization stung like salt in an open wound. What kind of father was he, that a stranger could reach his son more easily than he could? "Is that better?" Lily asked softly, handing Ethan a napkin to wipe the syrup from his chin. Ethan grinned, nodding. "You're really good at this." "Well," she said with a playful shrug, "I've had practice. My little brother used to spill his food on me all the time. You're doing way better than he ever did." Richard caught the subtle flicker in her eyes when she mentioned her brother. It wasn't a casual comment. There was weight behind it, pain, maybe even loss, but she masked it quickly, standing and smoothing down her apron. "You've been very kind," Richard finally spoke, his voice deep and resonant, though softened in tone. He wasn't used to thanking people. In his world, gratitude was currency. You exchanged it in deals, not in moments. Yet here he was, offering it freely. Lily gave him a small smile. He just needed someone to believe he could do it. That's all. Her words lingered in the air, echoing in Richard's mind like an accusation. Did he not believe in his own son enough? Or had he let his fear overshadow Ethan's courage? For a man who could control the fate of entire corporations with a single decision, Richard found himself paralyzed by one simple truth. He didn't know how to be the father Ethan needed. As Ethan happily continued eating, Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Lily. She was different. And something inside him whispered that she wasn't just passing through his life. No, this meeting, however ordinary it seemed, was a hinge moment. One that could open a door he didn't even know existed. But before Richard could dwell on it further, the man in the leather jacket slammed his mug onto the counter, shouting at the cashier about the coffee being too weak. The tension crackled once more, and Lily instinctively moved closer to Ethan's side. As though protecting him, Richard noticed. And something in his chest shifted again. The diner, usually a safe little haven of chatter and clattering plates, seemed to grow smaller as the man in the leather jacket raised his voice. He was rough around the edges, the kind of man who wore his bitterness like a second skin. The waitress behind the counter stammered an apology, but it only seemed to fuel his temper. He mocked her, sneering about cheap coffee and cheaper service, his words sharp enough to cut. Richard's eyes narrowed, his protective instincts flaring again. He had seen this type 100 times in boardrooms and banquets, the kind who fed on making others feel small, the kind who needed to prove they were bigger by belittling someone else. In his world, Richard usually silenced such men with power, money, or influence. But here in this tiny diner, he was just another customer. Ethan, oblivious at first, tried to keep eating, his fork trembling as he focused on the syrupy pancakes. But the man's next outburst made him jump, his hands jerking so that the fork slipped again, this time spraying syrup onto his shirt. A giggle rippled from a nearby booth, where a group of teenagers had been watching. It wasn't cruel at first, just that nervous, thoughtless laughter people sometimes give when something awkward happens. But to Ethan, it was a knife straight to his heart. His cheeks flushed crimson, his small fingers fumbling to wipe the sticky mess from his shirt. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling with shame. "I didn't mean to." Richard felt his chest tighten. He wanted to storm across the diner, silence the man at the counter, shut up the teenagers and scoop his son into his arms. But doing so would only spotlight Ethan's struggle more, and Richard knew his boy hated being pitied. So instead he froze, caught in that impossible space between anger and helplessness. It was Lily who acted. Without hesitation, she crouched down beside Ethan again, her voice light and steady as though nothing embarrassing had happened at all. "Hey, no worries. Syrup stains are like badges of honor around here," she said cheerfully, pulling a clean napkin from her apron. "You should see what happens when I try to eat pancakes on the run. Disaster zone." Her easy humor disarmed Ethan's shame. His lips curved into a reluctant smile, though his eyes still glistened with unshed tears. Lily wiped the syrup from his hands, then leaned close enough to whisper, "Don't listen to them. They don't matter." "You do." Richard's throat tightened at those words. They were so simple, yet they carried a weight he could never seem to deliver to his son himself. Watching Ethan's shoulders straighten, the billionaire realized something bitter. No matter how much he loved his boy, he still didn't know how to heal the invisible wounds others left on him. But the leather-jacketed man wasn't finished. He turned around now, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on Ethan. A smirk tugged at his lips. "Kid can't even eat without a babysitter. Figures. World's going soft." The words hung in the air like poison. The teens at the booth chuckled again, this time more confidently, emboldened by the man's cruelty. Richard felt a surge of fury so hot he nearly rose from his seat. But before he could speak, Ethan's small voice trembled out into the silence. "I can do it," Ethan whispered, though his hands shook as he picked up the fork again. His determination was brave, but his body betrayed him, the fork clattering uselessly once more against the plate. The laughter grew louder. Richard's jaw clenched, his fists curling under the table. Every instinct in him screamed to lash out, to crush the humiliation before it scarred his boy any further. Yet before he could move, Lily stepped forward, her voice ringing with a strength that silenced even the laughter. "That's enough," she snapped, standing tall despite her slim frame. Her eyes burned as she glared at the man. "I don't get to talk to him like that." The diner fell into stunned silence. No one spoke to the leather-jacketed man like that. But Lily didn't flinch, didn't waver. She moved back to Ethan's side, gently placing the fork in his hand again. "You're stronger than they'll ever know," she whispered to him, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Richard stared at her, caught between admiration and disbelief. In that moment, Lily wasn't just a waitress. She was a shield, a warrior, a voice that defended his son when he himself had faltered. Ethan looked up at her, his smile trembling but real. For the first time that night, his eyes weren't filled with embarrassment, they were filled with pride. But Richard knew this confrontation wasn't over. The man in the leather jacket pushed back from the counter, his chair screeching across the tiles. He wasn't going to let this slide. And as Richard shifted protectively toward his son, he realized he was about to learn exactly who Lily really was. The diner had gone silent, the kind of silence that weighs heavy, pressing against the walls and daring someone to breathe too loudly. The man in the leather jacket rose to his full height, his shadow stretching across the floor like a storm cloud. His eyes locked on Lily, and though she stood firm, Richard could see the tremor of tension in her hands. She wasn't reckless, she was brave, but bravery often came with a cost. "Big talk from a waitress in an apron," the man sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can tell me what to do?" Richard stood halfway now, his broad frame tense, his voice low but commanding. "That's enough. Sit down." For a moment the man's expression faltered. Something about Richard, the weight of his presence, the authority in his tone, made him hesitate. This wasn't just another diner dad. This was someone used to commanding armies of men. Though the stranger couldn't have known just how powerful the man before him really was. The tension broke when the cashier hurried forward, pleading with the leather-jacketed man to calm down, offering him a free refill. With a mutter of curses, he finally relented, stomping back into his seat. The teens looked away sheepishly, their laughter now tasting sour in their mouths. The air began to ease again, though the damage had already been done. Ethan sat frozen, his little shoulders tight as if holding back tears. His fork lay abandoned, his appetite gone. Richard slid closer to him, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay, son. You don't have to eat any more tonight." But Ethan shook his head, his lips pressing together in stubborn defiance. "I don't want them to win," he murmured, his eyes glistening. Richard's chest swelled with both pain and pride. He wanted to tell his son he was already braver than most men he'd ever met, that his resilience was a strength far greater than wealth or power. But the words caught in his throat unspoken, because Richard had never been good with words. His empire had been built on deals and contracts, not heart-to-heart truths. And so he sat silently, watching his son wage a private battle, wishing he knew how to help. It was Lily who bridged the silence once again. She leaned down beside Ethan, her voice steady, her smile gentle. "You know," she said, "when my brother was learning to play the guitar, he dropped it almost every day. Sometimes it landed on his toes, sometimes it made a noise so bad we thought the neighbors would complain. But he kept at it. Do you know why?" Ethan's eyes flicked up to hers, curious despite himself. "Why?" "Because every mistake meant he was one step closer to playing a song. Every fall, every failure, it was proof he was trying, and trying is braver than anything else." For the first time since the laughter, Ethan's lips curved into a faint smile. He picked up the fork again, gripping it tightly, his small hands trembling but determined. And this time, with Lily's quiet encouragement, the bite made it to his mouth without spilling. Richard felt something deep in his chest break open, a flood of gratitude, of awe, of aching realization. But as he watched Lily, he couldn't ignore the shadows in her own eyes. Her story about her brother hadn't been casual. It had been too precise, too heartfelt. There was pain stitched into her words, something unspoken that Richard recognized. She had lost something too. Maybe not in the same way he had lost Claire, but enough to understand the hollow ache of absence. When the rush of tension finally ebbed, Richard asked softly, "Your brother, does he still play?" For a split second, Lily froze. Then she forced a small smile. "He used to. Not anymore." She stood quickly, almost too quickly, straightening her apron. "Can I get you two anything else?" The shift in her tone was clear. Whatever her past held, it was locked tight behind a door she wasn't ready to open. Richard let it go for now, but the curiosity gnawed at him. He knew that pain when he saw it, because he carried it himself every day. The rest of the meal passed in relative calm, though Richard noticed Ethan glancing often at Lily, as though her presence alone gave him courage. Richard too found himself drawn to her, not in the way men chase beauty, but in the way broken souls recognize kindred spirits. She was more than she appeared, and he wanted to understand why. As they prepared to leave, Richard slipped a generous tip beneath the bill, so large it would make most servers gasp. But Lily, upon seeing it, shook her head and slid it back toward him. "I don't want your money," she said softly, her eyes steady on his. "I just want him to know he's stronger than he thinks." Richard was stunned. Nobody had ever turned down his money. Nobody. But Lily had, and in that refusal, she had just become the most extraordinary person he had met in years. He opened his mouth to say something, but Ethan tugged at his sleeve, his little voice pleading, "Dad, can we come back tomorrow, please?" And in that moment, Richard knew their paths weren't done crossing. The following afternoon, Richard found himself back at the diner, though he had told himself a dozen reasons not to return. He had business meetings waiting, contracts worth millions to sign, and investors demanding his presence. But none of it mattered. The image of Ethan's hopeful smile the night before, and Lily's unwavering kindness, had stayed with him like an echo he couldn't shake. Ethan had asked, almost begged, to return, and Richard, rarely a man swayed by anyone, could not say no to his son. When they entered, the diner was quieter, the lunch crowd just beginning to thin. Ethan perked up immediately when he spotted Lily at the far end, balancing a tray of drinks with practiced ease. She noticed them too, and her face lit with a genuine smile, the kind that seemed to erase the tiredness beneath her eyes. She waved at Ethan, who beamed back with such joy it made Richard's chest tighten. They settled into their booth, and before long, Lily was there with menus. "Back so soon?" she teased lightly. Ethan grinned. "I told Dad we had to come back. I want pancakes again." But this time, his eyes sparkled mischievously. I think I can do it without any help. Lily crouched beside him, her voice low but encouraging. That's the spirit. But remember, help doesn't make you weak. It just means you're smart enough to accept it when you need it. Richard watched them silent, his thoughts churning. He was beginning to see something in Lily that unsettled him. Not just kindness, not just patience, but wisdom, earned wisdom born of struggle. It was rare, and it was dangerous because it stirred something inside him he hadn't let himself feel in years. Trust. Their meal began peacefully, with Ethan determinedly managing his fork. Richard found himself relaxing for the first time in what felt like forever. But peace has a way of shattering at the worst possible moment. As Ethan leaned forward to take another bite, Richard noticed movement at the counter. The leather-jacketed man from the night before had returned, his presence like a dark cloud. He sat slouched on a stool, sipping his coffee, his eyes darting toward their booth with a look that was more than irritation. It was recognition. Richard's instincts sharpened. There was no way this was coincidence. The city was vast, and men like that didn't stumble into the same diner twice by chance. His gut told him something was wrong. Moments later, as Lily passed behind the man with a tray, Richard saw it happen. The man deliberately stuck out his leg. Lily stumbled, the tray tilting, the glasses crashing to the floor in a spray of water and shattered ice. Gasps filled the diner. Lily caught herself before falling, her face flushed with humiliation. The man smirked, clearly enjoying her stumble. "Clumsy little thing, aren't you?" he sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Richard rose halfway, fury building, but Lily straightened with a dignity that silenced even him. She met the man's sneer with calm eyes, her voice steady. Better to be clumsy than cruel. For a heartbeat, the diner seemed to hold its breath. The man's smirk faltered, his pride wounded. He muttered under his breath and turned back to his coffee, but Richard knew it wasn't over. He knew men like that. They didn't forgive humiliation. As Lily knelt to pick up the broken glass, Ethan slid out of the booth and crouched beside her, his little hands helping gather the shards. "Don't worry," he whispered, his voice full of earnest care. "You're not clumsy. You're the best." Richard felt his throat tighten at the sight, his son, who so often was the one needing help, now offering it to someone else. The boy's heart was pure, untainted by the cruelty of the world. And in that instant, Richard realized the truth. Lily wasn't just helping Ethan, she was teaching him something far greater than strength. She was teaching him empathy. But the twist came later that afternoon, when Richard and Ethan finally left the diner. As they stepped out into the crisp air, Richard's phone buzzed. It was his head of security, a man who rarely called unless the matter was urgent. "Mr. Callahan," the voice said, tight and grave, "we ran the background check you requested. On the waitress, Lily." Richard froze mid-step, glancing back through the glass at Lily, laughing gently with another customer. And there was a pause, then the answer Richard least expected. "She has a record, sir. Arrests for trespassing. Fired from 2 jobs, and..." Another pause, heavier this time. "Her brother, he didn't just stop playing guitar. He died. Car accident. She was the one driving." Richard's hand tightened around the phone. The world tilted, his mind a storm of disbelief and suspicion. The woman who had stepped in like an angel for his son carried shadows darker than he could have imagined. He looked back at her one more time, his thoughts colliding with one another. Who was Lily? A savior, or a danger he couldn't yet see? Richard barely slept that night. The report on Lily replayed in his mind again and again, each detail cutting into the fragile trust that had begun to take root. A criminal record, a tragic past, a death she might have carried on her conscience. He wanted to dismiss it all, to cling to what he had seen with his own eyes. The way she'd stood up for Ethan, the gentleness in her voice, the patience that had brought his son joy. But Richard hadn't built an empire by ignoring warning signs. He knew better than anyone how people could hide their true selves behind masks of kindness. And yet, when Ethan asked the next morning if they could go back to the diner, Richard couldn't bring himself to refuse. His son's eyes were bright with hope, his little voice pleading, and for once Richard couldn't bear to say no. So they went. Lily greeted them warmly, as though nothing in the world could weigh her down. She joked with Ethan, teased him about ordering the champion's pancakes again, and Richard found himself caught in the contradiction, how someone with such a troubled past could radiate so much light. He told himself he would keep his distance, keep watch, but as the meal went on, he saw Ethan blossom in her presence. His son laughed, really laughed, and Richard realized he hadn't heard that sound in years, but the shadows weren't finished. The leather-jacketed man appeared once more, this time with two others at his side. They weren't there for coffee. Richard could sense it immediately. They sat near the back, their eyes occasionally drifting toward Lily, and Richard's instincts screamed that this wasn't coincidence. It didn't take long. As Lily walked past their table, one of the men reached out, catching her wrist with a grip that made her flinch. "Hey, sweetheart," he drawled. "Still think you're better than us? Thought maybe we could talk outside." The diner went silent again. Richard's blood ran hot. He rose from his booth in one swift motion, his voice like steel. "Let her go." The man smirked, not releasing his grip. "And who's gonna make me? You." The room seemed to shrink around them. Richard was used to commanding rooms with words alone, but here words weren't enough. His fists clenched, his body tensing to strike. When Lily yanked her hand free and stood tall, her voice ringing with fire. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear flickering in her eyes. "Not anymore." The words hung heavy, and Richard caught the deeper meaning. This wasn't the first time she had faced men like these. This was personal. The men chuckled, but before they could act, Richard stepped forward, his frame towering, his eyes blazing with a fury that brooked no argument. "You don't want to test me," he said, each word sharp as a blade. Something in his tone, something commanding and dangerous, made the men hesitate. They weren't looking at an ordinary man. They were staring into the eyes of someone who had stared down bigger threats and won. Finally, with muttered curses, they backed off, retreating to their booth. The tension eased, but the damage was done. Ethan was pale, clutching his fork with white knuckles. Lily's hands shook as she carried an empty tray back to the counter, her composure cracking at last. Richard followed her, his voice low. "They've targeted you before, haven't they?" Her eyes glistened, but she didn't deny it. "People don't forget mistakes," she whispered. "They don't let you forget either." And then the truth poured out in fragments. How her brother had died in the accident she blamed herself for. How she'd spiraled after, taking jobs she couldn't keep, drifting from one place to another. How men like those had mocked her, taunted her, reminded her she'd never be good enough. Richard listened, torn. This woman who had carried such guilt was the same one who had given his son courage, dignity, hope. She was flawed, broken even, but wasn't he as well? Didn't they both carry ghosts? He glanced back at Ethan, who was watching anxiously, and felt the truth slam into him. It didn't matter what Lily's past was. What mattered was what she was giving his son now. Something money, doctors, and even he himself had never been able to give. But as he turned back to Lily, the leather-jacketed man rose once more, this time with fury in his eyes. "You think this is over?" he growled. The room froze. Richard instinctively moved in front of Ethan, shielding him, while Lily stiffened, ready to defend herself. The storm they had all tried to hold back was finally breaking. The diner seemed to shrink as the leather-jacketed man and his friends rose to their feet, blocking the exit. Chairs scraped, silverware stilled, and every pair of eyes turned toward the confrontation building in the middle of the room. Ethan clutched Richard's sleeve tightly, his small body trembling, but his eyes refused to leave Lily. She stood tall, though her hands shook. Her chin lifted as if to defy every demon that had ever haunted her. Richard's voice was calm, steady, but laced with steel. "If you want trouble, you found the wrong family," the leader sneered, his voice rough. "Family? That waitress doesn't belong to you. She doesn't belong anywhere. She's trash. Always has been." The words cut sharper than knives, aimed directly at Lily's scars. For a moment she faltered, her breath hitching as her past seemed to rise up against her. Richard saw it, the crack in her armor, the years of shame threatening to drag her under. And that was when Ethan, trembling but determined, did something no one expected. He pushed past his father, standing between Lily and the men, his little voice ringing out across the diner. "Don't talk to her like that." The room went utterly still. The boy who had been laughed at for spilling syrup, who had been mocked for his trembling hands, now stood like a warrior before the woman who had defended him. His small body shook, his voice wavered, but his courage burned brighter than the cruelty in the room. "She's not trash. She's my friend. And she's braver than you'll ever be. Lily's breath caught, tears springing to her eyes. Richard felt his heart break open wide, pride and love flooding him in a way he'd never known. His son, his fragile, struggling son, had just become the shield. The men looked at each other, their bravado faltering. There was no victory in crushing a child's courage. Richard stepped forward then, his towering presence final and unyielding. "Leave," he said simply, and this time they did. Muttering curses, they shoved out of the diner, the bell above the door jingling weakly behind them. Silence lingered for a long moment. Then the diner erupted in quiet applause. Not for Richard, not for his wealth, not even for Lily, but for Ethan, the little boy who had stood taller than men twice his size. Lily dropped to her knees beside him, tears slipping down her cheeks as she pulled him gently into her arms. "You were amazing," she whispered. "You don't know how much you just gave me." Ethan looked at her with a shy smile. "You gave me courage first." Richard swallowed hard, his vision blurring despite himself. He had never been prouder of his son, and he had never felt more indebted to someone than he did to the woman kneeling before him. Later, as the diner emptied and calm returned, Richard asked Lily quietly, "Why do you do it? Why help us? You don't even know us." She looked at him, her eyes still shining but steady. "Because I know what it feels like to fall, and I know how much it means when someone believes in you enough to help you stand again." Richard nodded slowly, his chest heavy with understanding. He thought of Claire, of the nights he had tried and failed to ease Ethan's struggles. He thought of his billions, how powerless they had been to give his son what Lily had given in one evening. And he realized something that humbled him to his core. Kindness could change more lives than money ever could. When they left the diner, Ethan clung to Lily, whispering, "Promise you'll be here tomorrow too?" She smiled, though there was sadness behind it. "If you want me to be, I'll always be here." Richard watched them, his heart shifting in ways he hadn't expected. He didn't see a waitress with a troubled past anymore. He saw a woman who had faced her demons and chosen every day to be light in a dark world. And in her reflection, he saw his own path forward, not as a billionaire, but as a father learning to fight alongside his son. As the night air wrapped around them, Richard knew life had changed forever. Not because of contracts or wealth, but because a waitress had dared to feed a boy with trembling hands, and in doing so, she had fed his soul with courage. The story wasn't about power. It wasn't about money. It was about something greater. A split-second act of bravery had created a bond that no cruelty, no past, no pain could ever break. And for Richard, Ethan, and Lily, it was the beginning of a new chapter, written not in gold but in love.